We're seeing another one of the greats retire at the end of this season, and I think it's time to take a second to look at the generational shift in the NWSL 1 year removed from the ratification of the league's new CBA. I am Claire Watkins, the host of The Late Sub. It is Wednesday, October 1st, and we're going to be diving into some legends retiring, what that means for the future of the league, how its relationship to the US Women's National Team, as always, impacts everything, and where I think the NWSL sits in the market not only of global football, but women's sports in America as the regular season nears a close in 2025. Let's dig in. So Angel City captain and defender Allie Riley announced this week that the 2025 NWSL season will be her last after a fabulous career that spanned multiple Olympics, World Cups, European Club Championships, and a really nice, strong NWSL leadership stint at the end, both with the Orlando Pride and with Angel City. And it kind of gave me some pause, and we were doing this a lot last year, but I think that this year, sort of with the moment that the NWSL is having, worthwhile to take a sec and sort of reflect on, it's been a big couple years of retirements, kind of a generational changing of the guard. Riley in particular was a real pioneer of the sport, especially in that time where she went to Europe after playing in WPS folds. She goes to Sweden, she plays in Germany, she plays in England, and she did that during a time when you didn't see as many top US grown talents making that decision. She had a wonderful club career in Europe before coming back to play for the first time in the NWSL. And she was always kind of respected as a player who always knew what she needed as a footballer and making that choice as far back as 2012. Imagine kind of making that jump to Sweden in 2012 and just known as a wonderful leader and a wonderful contributor to the world of women's football. But even that, right, to kind of take a look at someone who is, like I said, a trailblazer, a pioneer of the sport during one of the crucial couple of decades of women's football in the entire world, it really kind of hits you sort of the vastness of a lot of these retirements that we've seen over the last, let's say, like 3 years, right? Riley joins huge names like Becky Sauerbrunn, Tobin Heath, Alex Morgan. I even put Morgan Gautrat in here. 2-time World Cup winner Morgan Gautrat has left the NWSL for good. Kelly O'Hara, Christine Sinclair, Megan Klingenberg. The list really goes on with this group of players that changed not only the way we perceive women's football on the pitch, but also off of the pitch. Just monumental generation of players stepping away from the game. And this year you are kind of seeing maybe the last mainstays of that group kind of making that call because, time waits for no one. And it does make you think a little bit about other players who might also be thinking about what's next. This is, I'm not reporting anything, but, Sydney Leroux hasn't played much this year. Kristen Press is out of contract in just a few weeks. Alyssa Nair is out of contract with Chicago in just a few weeks. Jess Fishlock out of contract with Seattle. Once their run is over, I think they're going to make the playoffs, but once that run is over, Lola Bonta is out of contract with Kansas City at the end of this year. There are just some big question marks of again, that final vestige of generational players that are still trucking in the league week in and week out, but will eventually have to make that similar choice that we've seen these giants of the sport make over the last couple of years. And I think it kind of ties into this larger NWSL conversation we've been having over the last couple of months around kind of the question marks of what is happening with stardom in the NWSL. Players like, Trinity Rodman in her contract negotiations with the Washington Spirit, how those are going, seeing Alyssa Thompson move to Chelsea, Naomi Girma move to Chelsea. What does it mean to be an NWSL star or to be a US-based soccer star as we are seeing a generational shift? And that kind of puts us into sort of this transformative 2-year period for the NWSL as we see the legends move on and the young stars rise. And I kind of want to also poke at, it's been almost exactly 1 year since last year's historic collective bargaining agreement ratification that changed the entire way that the NWSL operates. What does that mean? Where are we sort of I think we have this conversation every week of sort of the ins and outs of what does it mean to play in the NWSL right now versus maybe even just 2 years ago. How has the CBA changed things? How has this generational changing of the guard changed things? And I've compiled it into 3 main thoughts. So we're gonna break this down to 3 different ways, kind of what we've seen generationally, what we've seen from the NWSL, and what we've seen 1 year removed from this brand new collective bargaining agreement. But let's talk about the generational shift. So this is a lot of really big picture stuff, but it's the equal pay pioneers, right? It's the international stalwarts who played in the NWSL. I include Riley in that, who had a wonderful career with New Zealand, Christine Sinclair, some of those Canadian legends that played the game in the United States. We're still seeing Marta kick in. I should have, had her up above as one of those players. Maybe you just wonder where her head is at in terms of end of career, though, as we know, Marta might just play forever. I'll be 107 years old and Marta will still be playing professional soccer. But we're also seeing a perspective shift, let's say that, for younger players coming in as well. We see this every single year with new signings, new young players that we speak to. They're literally a different generation, but they're moving into a landscape of a decent amount of league stability where teenagers can sign pro deals directly. Pro soccer has always been an option since they were very young. The NWSL is not really in danger of folding, which is crazy to think, but it just wasn't that long ago where people were like, how many years can this league string together to make sure that it becomes too big to fail? The European game is rising. We're seeing those conversations with a long way to go, but we're beginning to see some of those conversations in Europe of putting the women's game kind of at the same playing level as the men's game there. And it's still pretty neat to me. I'm not too old, but it's still pretty neat for me to hear younger players say that they had a favorite NWSL team growing up or a favorite women's professional soccer player outside of just the U.S. construct growing up. And that's something that this last generation of players who are beginning to step away really fought for very hard. But within all of that positive change and the excitement of seeing these players walk into an environment, globally, that has made this a legitimate career and something that no one is having to fight as much just for their basic livelihood, it still does feel like the US-based version of women's soccer is in between. We're kind of in between this consistent group of stars. I think they look to the US a lot of times for that North Star of like who some of those players are. They're always trying to attract top-level internationals, though, as we know, the pull of Europe has been very hard to compete with in the last couple of years. Those players that fans associate year in and year out with the teams and the performances that they know the best. Just kind of that easy water cooler, snap your fingers, you go, I like that player, I saw that player play in this big game. I think the failure for the U.S. Women's National Team to perform particularly well in 2023 has impacted this pretty significantly. There are numerous players on that 2023 team that are still very strong contributors to the NWSL and beyond, but the prestige of that particular tournament, especially on the U.S. side, I think wore off very quickly. It was a difficult tournament for fans in the U.S. to watch. I was one of them, waking up at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., trying to catch games. The U.S. crashes out early. You do see kind of the apex of what Spain is able to accomplish, and that was a very, very big moment. Certainly, even all the controversy that followed. But not for nothing, a lot of those players also on the U.S. side were rising or NWSL lifers. And just the intention on them is a little bit quieter, I think, sort of in the wake of what was perceived as a very disappointing tournament from the U.S. in 2023. And I think the Olympics in 2024 have been a little bit harder for the NWSL to grab onto for a variety of reasons, and I'll talk about that in my second bullet. But I think we are still seeing these question marks of we know what Sophia Wilson can do. We know what Mel Swanson can do. We know what Trinity Rodman can do, like that triple espresso moment. But it's not exactly like we've gotten a ton of triple espresso in 2025. So how does the NWSL continue to cultivate that stardom when they aren't getting that clear directive from the U.S. Women's National Team? And I think the equal pay deal that was done by this past generation does also change what has been known as a first-team U.S. player traditionally, or even as we see kind of deeper scouting, deepening of player pools with other teams across the world. Moving into game call-up bonuses, which are far more valuable, to be clear, like this is a huge positive, but the old model was that a U.S. player was closer to full-time employment. Now we're seeing players get picked up and dropped more frequently. Less of that core in the past that literally worked for U.S. soccer. We're also consequently seeing a change in approach from head coach Emma Hayes, right? That first full year of international friendly, we're seeing in a good way. None of this is a negative, but it does have a ripple effect of the team taking some of the soccer focus first, being willing to deepen that player pool, to not rely on just having the same stars go out over and over and over and over again. Yes, the U.S. wants to sell tickets, but this isn't that same kind of like fan fest tour of the USA that we've seen from the team in the past. Those were bad. Nobody liked the victory tours, but they did cultivate a little bit of lore around the team that you just don't see as much. They are positive soccer changes. and positive changes in that these players are getting paid way more per game than they were as full-time employees of U.S. soccer. But it does challenge our concepts of what a U.S. women's national team star functionally is, especially in a non-major tournament year. And I think we are also seeing, again, you talk about players speaking up with all that stability, success, and even that back and forth of less guaranteed time on the biggest stage, which is, as we know, still international women's soccer. We're still seeing a generational shift of players coming up who are still finding their voices. The generation stepping away, and I think you talk about, again, those huge names that kind of tower over the history of the fight for equality in the U.S. soccer programs and beyond. This is a global push. Again, I talk about what happened with Spain after the World Cup in 2023. You saw those voices rise in Europe, and you saw them rise in South America, and you saw them rise in Africa. These players have been advocating for themselves for a long time, but this particular generation was pretty incredible in their willingness to keep the conversation going off the pitch. Like, I keep saying generation, but they were generational in their ability to speak on social issues and deliberate on collective action and get buy-in. And even if there were maybe some individual disagreements in the locker room or within the players union, being able to put together a unified front because they understood that was more important than maybe individual doubts or qualms that they could have behind closed doors. Sometimes they were retaliated against for that by U.S. Soccer, by the NWSL. Again, we've seen what happened in Spain, where players have been left off, some of them permanently, from the Spanish women's national team because of their willingness to speak up against poor management and what they considered to be adverse conditions. And as the next generation kind of finds their footing on the field, you hope to see that advocacy continue. I mean, I think it's no question of anybody listening to this that it is still greatly needed despite all of that security, at least not security, but at least like stability, right? The leagues aren't going anywhere. And you can't stop underlining how that was a serious issue for the players of the past. But you want these natural leaders to make themselves known for the greater good. And I'm really curious to see who's going to step up in that role, because we know who the stars are on the pitch, right? Even if we haven't seen them that much this year, but who's going to be that next person to kind of, place their flag in the ground and say, this is what this team stands for. This is how I'm going to lead. And that's not a dig on the newer generation. They're finding their own way. They're hopefully, like I said, facing fewer obstacles and material support year after year. Like, you want these issues to subside. But I don't think I'm going to tell anybody that there's no need for advocacy from a U.S. women's national team because of the huge platform that they do have. And so I'm just so curious to see with Giants stepping away, with a little bit less guaranteed call-ups with the U.S. women's national team, with just kind of figuring out what the next great battle will be, who is going to be that next great leader as well as star, because that's not always the exact same thing. Which also leads me to my second question, which is, does it feel like this quieter international year for the U.S. women's national team has given the NWSL room to grow into sort of that pocket of attention that maybe would have been overtaken by the U.S. in a major tournament year? Fundamentally, the answer is I don't know. The NWSL has mostly maintained the status quo in a year. I mean, they could have seen it as an opportunity to really push, whether it's, in terms of marketing or strategic partnerships, or just trying to make as much noise as possible as the U.S. takes a little bit more of a back seat. I was talking about the old victory tours of the past, or like that, again, the sort of like fan fest tour of the USA that the U.S. used to do. An old adage of NWSL coverage for years has been a frustration with U.S. women's national team interference, like taking up all the oxygen in the room. But that hasn't happened as much this year. And I still don't necessarily think that the NWSL has quantifiably crushed it in a year where maybe they had a little bit more space to grow. As discussed ad nauseum, I think some of the biggest discussions of the league this year have been young stars leaving, making the jump to Europe, in part due to the perceived lack of platform or prestige in the NWSL, despite playing in front of a lot of fans every week. There's been a clear lack of parity at the top of the table, which is both awesome on behalf of Kansas City, but perhaps a little disappointing that we haven't seen a real challenge for the Shield this year. Playoff race has been very exciting, though, and we will talk about that more in the upcoming weeks. We've seen unsteady leadership on weather delays, player emergencies, maybe a lack of focus on the soccer product, when there was a lot of opportunity this year just to show off the quality of play. And I'd go so far as to say that it feels like a lot of clubs are spinning their wheels. There have been a lot of clubs that are maybe happy to compete for a playoff spot with no real vision as to how they want to make a championship bid, as Kansas City kind of runs away with the league. Now, I don't put all of these clubs into this, but you can see where the drop-off is. And I think the league is having trouble focusing eyeballs necessarily on those teams stuck in the middle. It's a very American problem to have sort of this single entity, not to go all pro-rel. I don't mind the single entity, but this is a very American problem where sometimes you have teams that just want to hit their benchmarks and then go home. It hasn't always necessarily felt like the NWSL has done some of the educating necessary to get the casual women's sports fan interested in soccer. I think sometimes basketball, as we've seen this explosion of the popularity of basketball, it's a little bit more accessible for an American casual sports fan. Basketball is a very American game. It's woven into, everything that we do in our culture and has been for a very long time. Soccer, there is a little bit more educating. If you have someone who maybe has felt disenfranchised by sports in general, they're interested in women's sports, they become that casual women's sports fan. Do they know, what a six does? Do they know, why it's important that, your triangle or your inverted triangle in the midfield is sound, because they're seeing center backs get blown up and they don't know why? Do they know players other than these big US stars that maybe haven't played as much in the NWSL this year? And that has been maybe a detriment. Again, I keep going back to 2023, but those international competitions that are used to boost those names, we always talk about the World Cup bump, the Olympic bump, not even just with US stars, but the Ali Rileys of the soccer world. We just haven't found that through line yet. And I don't know if the NWSL is successfully putting together must-see TV the way, again, who I consider to be their direct competitor for the casual women's sports fan, which is the WNBA, is doing every single week. The dub is much-watched TV, and I don't know if we're getting the same thing from the NWSL. And I also think it's fair to say that players, I talked a lot about how the NWSL is separating itself from the U.S. Women's National Team, how the U.S. Women's National Team structure is changing. It's supposed to be more equitable. It's supposed to lay priorities on these clubs and have a little bit closer to what we see in the men's game, where you have a player that primarily plays for a club team. And if they get called up for their international team, great. I don't know that we can confidently, though, say that players aren't still putting U.S. Women's National Team needs at a high priority this year, even in absentia, versus really leaning into club play. Like, shout out to Sam Coffey. I think that she is like the gold standard of a player who has really become entrenched with her club side and has become like the most important person on the pitch for them in a year where the U.S. has less programming going on. Obviously, Trinity Rodman's genuine struggles with her back injury didn't help. I'm not saying that is like a U.S. issue, but I do think we have seen players take a step back. We've seen family planning, which is wonderful, but also seems very delicately timed for the U.S. calendar. I think we've seen, just players with slower rehabs. We finally have seen some Rose Lavelle in the second half of the season, which is awesome. We are still just seeing that cadence, though, where it just feels like the U.S. Women's National Team looms over everything. And again, I don't know if I think that should go away. I think the U.S. being good is very important to the health of the NWSL, but it is notable when we're talking about kind of trying to find that next great player, the next star, or specifically that through line from the Olympic team, where I don't think there was a ton of momentum in 2025 with those players because we just haven't gotten to see them very much. But even within that, flip it, is the good. And there's one huge positive for the NWSL this year as it relates to the U.S. Women's National Team. And I don't want to undercut it, which is that with that absentia, with that open space in the NWSL and in the U.S. Women's National Team, as they keep looking to deepen the player pool, a ridiculous number of NWSL or NCAA grown players earned U.S. caps this year and freaked it. They slayed. I think we are getting to know some of these players. You just hope that some of them hold on to the team next year. Talking about your Avery Pattersons, your Lily Reels, Emma Sears, Ali Sentner, Claire Hutton, Croy Bethune. The list goes on and on of players that are competing week in and out in the NWSL that did shine when given international opportunities this year. Is it helpful that they were on the quote-unquote experimental rosters? I don't know. Are they going to make it to World Cup qualifying next year? I also don't know. But that is kind of the NWSL guarantee. For as much as we do focus on the increasing Euro club presence on the U.S. Women's National Team and those big name players who have maybe made the leap for different opportunities, all of these NWSL players have shown up at the international level ready to compete. And that, like I said, is the NWSL guarantee. It is so solid. But now again, the genuine hope is that these are the players that maybe become the major tournament heroes of the future, and not in a way where it felt like the U.S. was picking those players up later in their NWSL careers, like in that build up to 2023. There is storytelling happening out there, but the NWSL is kind of in this position where they do need some of those feel-good stories, these young players coming up and succeeding, the exciting, again, dynamic play of some of the outside backs that have come through the NWSL or some of these forwards that have come through the NWSL, but they need those stories to pan out. And we just won't know if that's going to happen until we get to 2026. And then finally, within all of that, we're talking about unions and contracts and how they impact the way the world goes around. What has this new CBA impacted in terms of positives, or maybe some kinks to work out in the NWSL 1 year away from it being ratified? It came kind of suddenly last year. It was announced in September and made some pretty incredible changes. As people know, it abolished the college draft. It abolished the expansion drafts. It had revenue share for the first time, the idea that the salary cap could be poured back into because the league is doing well. All of that stuff is really important. I think it has impacted the international play in terms of the international players that have come into the NWSL very positively. I think that it has widened the rookie player pool in a really, really cool way. But there are actually some challenges to that too, right? Like the rookie storytelling, for example, has been impacted a little bit, even as these teams have quietly had a better pipeline for talent. You look at the Rookie of the Year race, it helps sometimes. It's the construct, it's kind of the pageantry of it all. If you don't have a number one pick, you don't know you don't necessarily know, again, as the casual fan, who you're following through the year to decide whether or not their expectations were too high or too low. It's more like what they do in global football. But again, when you have some of the other Americanisms like a salary cap and the single entity and all of that in a US based league, people expect some of that other more American storytelling. And we are seeing that who's next group of players bubbling to the surface. But we still need to see that continued success, and we just don't necessarily have a good example of what the expectations are for these players going into a season. We lose that number one pick narrative. Even if it's truly just like losing that basic hype machine whirring. I think a good example is like some of the young players for San Diego, where they've got this wealth of like teens and young players who are doing such a nice job. But now you're kind of just waiting to see, does this pan out in winning a Shield someday? Does this pan out in winning a championship someday? Or is this going to pan out in, frankly, US Women's National Team caps? And without knowing what the future holds, it's very difficult to kind of place expectation judgments and also even just be able to discuss who those young players are until we sort of see that validation from the outside. It's also going to provide a very interesting path for the expansion teams. There's no expansion draft. The Boston Legacy actually just announced that they're signing 18-year-old Chloe Ricketts, who was one of those teens in Washington, D.C., who didn't quite pan out in their win now plans. A good example of how even some of the young signing narratives get lost, where you see they're like, oh, the youngest signing in NWSL history or the third youngest signing in NWSL history. Some of those players also get lost as teams figure out how to utilize that U18 rule without hopefully having to cast young players aside. And while the player choice and median salary is still very, very solid in the NWSL post new CBA, the league hasn't overcome the salary cap questions, even as players live very comfortable, good lives as professional soccer players. And you could go back to previous episodes of this show to chew on that conundrum that isn't going away. But again, it's also defanged some of these parity rules that didn't serve player goals. I do genuinely think getting rid of the draft is going to, has and will continue to help the NWSL compete for players' first contracts, rather than college players feeling like instead of going to the draft, they want to make a jump to a different league where that isn't necessary. I think that there is no question that the NWSL is incredibly competitive for that young player first contract, getting players into their professional careers. It's opened up a real international flair to the NWSL that wasn't there before. I mean, Temwa Chawinga should be the league's back-to-back MVP this year in 2025. Barbara Banda, incredibly successful. The African talent that we've seen in this league is an incredible story. Japanese players, Brazilian players, hopefully to continue a stronger relationship with Liga MX Femenil. There's an opening up happening in the league with this emergent talent, that's what I'm saying. Like the NWSL is this emergent talent cauldron that really gets a chance to shine here. And you do see fans fall in love with those players. But then that's the question of, can they keep them? And so kind of my final thesis is looking at all of this with these giants of the leagues retiring, with the new CBA, with the new US structure, and a very different coach than they've had in the past. NWSL is an incredible emergent talent league right now. And you're going to see some of the best young players in football in the entirety of the world every week in this league. But can they hold on to them? Can they stop treading water? Can they get that prestige going again without having to attach it to an international team? That's the question, and it would be trailblazing all on its own. The Late Sub is part of the Just Women Sports Network. This show is written by Claire Watkins and produced and edited by Parker Fenton. To get more of your favorite women's sports content, subscribe to the Just Women Sports newsletter and follow Just Women Sports across all your favorite channels.